Just as the American government prepared to ban TikTok, an unexpected twist saw American users flocking to a genuine Chinese app. RedNote, an app whose name is reminiscent of the quotation from the chairman Mao Zedong, often jokingly referred to as the Little Red Book. In today's conversation with Tings Chak from the Tricontinental Institute, we explore this phenomenon and many other topics related to China's evolving role on the world stage. Tings, along with Vijay Prashad, has written about the challenge faced by the Communist Party of China over the last 75 years, providing valuable insights into what Western Marxists can learn from this history, and addressing the misconceptions they have developed around China's socialist project, especially during the transitions from Mao to Deng Xiaoping, and now under Xi Jinping. While recent US administrations have invested heavily in media production to control narratives both domestically and internationally, this dollar-fueled anti-China rhetoric has backfired, igniting a resurgence in political consciousness among the Chinese masses. Despite this revitalization, China still grapples with projecting its vision beyond its borders. However, we may soon witness significant shifts, as seen with the so-called TikTok refugees migrating to RedNote. This context provides a backdrop for understanding China's strategic responses while navigating its non-interventionist stance, and Tings shared her perspective on the emerge of grassroots activism and the influence of socialist intellectuals on governance and society in China, as it navigates its non-interventionist stance while promoting its own brand of internationalism abroad. This context sets the stage for understanding China's strategic responses, in stark contrast to the lack of vision that characterizes neoliberalism. China has been playing the long game all along. Or, as some memes suggest, the CIA has revealed Xi Jinping's shocking plan to sit back, do nothing, and enjoy the fall of US empire. Join us as we engage in this critical dialogue with Tings Chak, unraveling the complexities of China's cultural warfare and geopolitical strategy on the global stage.
Hi everyone, this is a new episode of 99 Media, that is the English spin-off of the Italian media OTTOLINATV, and today we have the great honor to have with us Tings Chak of Tricontinental, but the real host of this episode will be Michele Gelato from Hong Kong, that is our dear old friend, and so I shut up and give him the honor to lead this interview.
Okay. Yeah. By the way, my name is not really Gelato, but yeah, it's funny. I'll keep it that way. So yeah, so it's great to have you here, Tings. And just a first question, just to break the ice, will be that with the Trump selection, one of the most uncertain things remains still the future of TikTok. And we've seen TikTok going dark in the US and then making a potentially temporary comeback. But what perhaps nobody could have predicted was the irony of having millions of US users flock towards an actual Chinese app like RedNote. So how do you see things going from here?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. And I really thought that all Italians' names were gelato. So you've taught me something today that's not the case. So thank you for correcting my ignorance. But what a great story to begin with. It's quite a great irony, this whole TikTok debacle. Oh, will they ban? Will they not ban? All those congressional hearings, everything like that. They can't tell the difference between a Singaporean and a Chinese person. All kinds of things happened in the last year around TikTok. But as you already mentioned, it caused probably a pretty unexpected turn towards a real Chinese app, a full Chinese app, which is RedNote, or the name in English is RedNote. In Chinese, it's Xiaohongshu, or literally the Little Red Book. So we saw the ban, and before the ban happened, as you said, hundreds and thousands of people. The last thing I had read was about 500,000 people from the US had already migrated to Xiaohongshu, even though they're pretty different platforms, and this is a small number compared to the total number of users of TikTok. I mean, in the US, there's something like 170 million people on that platform. more than half of the population. It's huge. So anyways, a portion of those people went over to Xiaohongshu and inadvertently, I guess, they got to get in touch with 300 million normal Chinese people on that platform, and we've seen very, very interesting kinds of posts on both sides, where people are just talking about, what is the cost of vegetables in China or in the US, or what's the cost of rent? Do people own homes? How is public transportation? Really, I think bread and butter issues, what normal people care about, working class people, everyday people care about. And in that sense, I think it created what's now been referred to as the Streisand effect, right? The Barbara Streisand effect, which is really when people are trying to hide or remove, delete some personal information, this causes a whole bunch of people to actually want to go and discover and actually share and find out more. And in a way, sort of the evil China, the big bad China, people get to have firsthand information from ordinary Chinese people. And I saw this meme, and I think you might have seen it as well circulating, which basically has this guy from the US, and it says, everything that the US government has told me about China is a lie. And then on the other side of the meme is there's a Chinese woman says, everything that the Chinese government has told me about the US is actually true. And in a way, that's kind of, it's obviously a little bit, humorous way, but I think it has created that effect. Of course, Trump has already tried to roll back, at least temporarily, this ban, giving a 75 grace day period. I don't know exactly what will happen 75 days later. But I think one of the interesting things is that it's as much as the US really spends huge amounts on this sort of disinformation campaign on China, having announced another $1.6 billion in this, fund to counter the CPC information bill that was passed. This is actually one way that, they were able to sort of break that sort of, it's the Chinese Great Firewall, but it's not really, because people are actually going towards willingly towards the Chinese platform. So it's quite interesting. Maybe I'll just share one little anecdote is I found very interesting reading on Xiaohongshu is one of the Chinese people said that, and it's been circulating quite a lot, said that, oh, China has 2 little red books. You've now discovered 1 little red book. You just have to find the other little red book and you'll find the answers there. So I love that one. And so hopefully more people from the US will discover the other little red book.
I mean, this story of TikTok has become obviously also a big geopolitical, argument. And what we see, do you think that Chinese government is like having a dialogue with Trump for the TikTok futures? We have seen, for example, in the last days, Trump investing and announcing a huge investment in Stargate, and Musk being not very happy about that because we are like their competitor. And there are rumors that maybe Trump is like trying to compensate him with this joint venture, with his role in this joint venture that he has announced for the TikTok future. I mean, do you have any idea what is going on and what could happen from this point of view?
I mean, I don't really know exactly on that point, but one thing that I found is quite interesting is because we actually do have TikTok in China, but it's run differently because we have there's the TikTok in the US that has a different structure and data is held separately. And then here, the TikTok version is called Douyin. One of the things that has happened after this sort of red note situation is that China has actually now, for the first time, opened the Chinese Douyin for people without Chinese cell phone numbers. So that's quite an interesting, as the sort of US is sort of trying to do this sort of protectionism closing in, we're actually seeing that digital space opening up. So I'm not really answering your answer directly, but I think there's something interesting from the Chinese response on that end. And actually, Xi Jinping said something around, oh, let's stop calling these TikTok refugees. People are welcome here. We share one human community. Welcome to dialogue. We are open to exchange, especially between the peoples of, not only between US and China, but, the rest of the world. So I think that's an interesting posture. Maybe I'll just add one thing. You mentioned Musk. It was really interesting to see at the inauguration. Of course, not only Musk, now he's this unelected great leader of this newly invented something, I can't remember now, the Department of Government Efficiency or something like that. But next to him, of course, clapping alongside was like Mark Zuckerberg. We have Jeff Bezos, really the oligarch billionaire class, the tech giants, in the US. And it's so interesting because in a way, when we think about, their ties, we know it's well studied, the ties with the military and industrial complex, the financial sector. I mean, these are those billionaires getting richer and richer as the average person from the US is getting poorer and poorer and not getting their share. But one thing I think that is so interesting about how these Chinese platforms actually developed was in relation to this so-called Great Firewall of China. China's actually been able to develop its own social media platforms, which ironically is now drawing some people from the West. And I think it's now one of the only countries we can say that has some level of digital sovereignty from US domination, because it has built robust systems in these tech sectors that also, as much as they do have a lot of sort of let's say power in an economic sense, they don't have political power in China. They will not be sitting in the halls of power like the Jeff Bezos and the Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks. So that's a huge difference. So I think this teaches us quite a few things beyond the sort of entertaining things we get out of Red Note and TikTok is around the question of digital sovereignty. There's no such thing as national sovereignty today without digital sovereignty. And this is actually something in Tricontinental we're focusing quite a lot on this year, and hopefully we'll put out a study not only looking at the Chinese example, but on a broader kind of comparative look.
Michele.
Yeah. So we recently actually had Gabriel Rockhill here in Hong Kong. I'm based in Hong Kong, by the way. And it was quite interesting because like the crowd was not necessarily all crowd of anti-imperialists. So we actually had a lot of like debates. And like many Western leftists sympathize with Marxist principles, but they remain skeptical about China's political project, both under Mao and now. And you, together with Vijay Prashad, you've written about the challenges that the CPC faced in their struggles toward national rejuvenation. Are there any takeaways that Western Marxists could learn from China past 75 years? And what do you think are the main misconceptions that Western leftists have about the CPC's journey?
Sure. Also, by the way, I heard about that event you were at, that some of the information was circulating here in groups in Beijing as well. So that sounds like a very interesting event.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually from Hong Kong originally, so maybe next time we'll have to meet and have a coffee or a beer or something. Anyways, back to the show. It's so interesting. Western Marxists, Western leftists. I mean, I spent a lot of my time living in the US. That's why I'm living in Canada. Sorry. That's why I have an accent like this. So I know this sort of branch of Marxism well. It seems like, there's an interest only in socialism in theory, as you already alluded to in your question, but there's really no patience when it comes to real existing socialism, what it means actually seize state power. What does it actually mean to create try to build socialism? It's not a from one day to the next. Absolutely not. If anything, 75 years has taught us, which was a bit of what we were looking into, both Vijay and I, in this article that you mentioned. And I think one of the misconceptions is based on, I think, this lack of historical patience. I mean, I know there's a lot of joke, the Chinese patience, like it's some, wise, ancestral thing that Chinese people have, but there is some truth to that, I think a lot of times Western Marxists just lack that historical patience. If you think, 75 years ago is not that long ago. That's the lifetime of my grandparents. They're still living, and this is the China that they would have experienced. But 75 years ago, just to paint a picture of what China looked like, it was coming out of 2 decades of brutal war, civil war, but also a Japanese occupation that took the lives of 20 million people, which also lots of Western Marxists like to leave out in this Western account of World War II history, right? Not only they not like to talk about the 27 million Soviets that died, but also the 20 million Chinese people that resisted Japanese occupation. that being said, a lot of things I think everyone already knows: century of humiliation, the place you live in right now, Hong Kong was seized, Opium War. Basically, what in a century we saw China being going from the largest economy in the world in the early 19th century to one of the poorest. We're talking about, there's only 10 countries in the world that were poorer than China on a per capita GDP basis. So how do you build a country from that, from that wreckage, from those centuries of imperialist and colonial domination? And now you're going to seize the states, you're going to seize the economy, all the inherited vestiges of that society, including the cultures, the values, the ways of seeing. And then you're going to try to build a new society and a new human being in the process. I mean, come on, 75 years is too short to even begin that process. We're still in the very beginning if you think about the long historical trajectory. So I think in some ways, there's many, and we can talk about it afterwards too. And I think there's in different periods, we can assess the different phases and experiments and socialism really as a series and a continual series of experiments, and this starts not only when the seizing of power in 1949, that's already started back in the 1930s and 40s when the CPC was down in building a Soviet in the south of China, and realizing, okay, after some years in Jiangxi, building, the initial land reform processes, building a base and building all the organizational structure, what did they have to do? They had to go on a strategic retreat, the so-called Long March, to start all again. And then in Yan'an, start all again, build the first experiments again of larger land reform processes, cultural programs, literacy programs, etc. And so when you come to 49, you have basically 2 decades of experimentation under your belt. But then you go through a new phase, and then we have the Mao period, and we can talk about some of these more specifically. I don't want to go into, 75 years and go year by year. But I think what happened is that, I mean, we have 5,000 years, so I could go really long. But I think one of the things that, especially in the period of Deng Xiaoping, in the opening up reform period, it's the place that I think a lot of leftists and Marxists begin to have very, very quick assessment that, okay, that means that China has abandoned the socialist path, right? China has for sure now gone down the capitalist path. And I think many people have been stuck in that period. And I think, but that's not, I think China changes so quickly. And actually there's these words in Chinese and very much in the communist tradition of self-reform and self-revolution. And each of these phases, the party and how the party has governed has gone through this self-transformation, self-revolution, and recognizing many of the contradictions and mistakes that come out of every period, So many times I hear people like, oh, but then, what about the Cultural Revolution? I mean, most people here right now are not thinking about 50 years ago. They're thinking about how do you build, resolve the questions of today and build socialism in the future, learning from those mistakes. But there's all this constant need to, what about that though? What about those mistakes? But you can't get stuck, I think, in a certain period, a historical period, and lose the larger historical trajectory. I think that's one of the big mistakes. Maybe just to close off this point, I think it's so interesting, and I really enjoyed what President Xi Jinping said at the National Congress, the 20th National Congress that took place 2 years ago. And he was basically saying, okay, 10 years ago when he started his presidency, what was the situation like after now a couple of decades of opening up reform? And he said, many achievements have been made. We can see that. We can visibly see hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty. But many problems also emerged. He talked about things such as corruption. He talked about, the lost confidence in socialism. He talked about imbalanced and unsustainable development method, like very, very strong words to assess. That is also part of this process of, okay, how do you reset or adjust the course? And I think we've seen many, many impressive feats in the last 10 years of trying to sort of self-correct, whether it's around addressing poverty, addressing questions of environment, many other things that maybe we can go into more detail about. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, perhaps like taking off from there, actually, like one thing you noticed you noted in the article about the 75 years of Chinese Revolution is that during the Mao era, the state encouraged grassroots political power. do you see a trend of depoliticization, or do you see this trend of depoliticization having happened in the previous decades? And how do you see this project going right now? What do you think is the place of the socialist intellectual in today's Chinese landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about this economic opening up, it's not just capital, that flows in. It's also all the ideology that comes with it. So there's no doubt that it created a generation of people that, have, let's say, it's not a pro-West or not pro-West, but they're basically liberal ideologies that really came in very, very strongly. So many people really do believe that opening up with the West, this focus specifically on the global North, particularly in that early period, 80s and 90s, of learning from the West, sending young people to study, be able to get the investments, to be able to develop productive forces in that period. So that it created a depoliticization, and many people have written about this and it felt this in their daily life. At the same time, though, I think in the last 10 years, specifically, I think Trump 1 helped us in that sense, create a new era of politicization. Of course, he, really started this trade war, which has deepened through the Biden years into this, imposed new Cold War mentality, various methods of, hybrid warfare that we're seeing, whether we talked about the media side, the misinformation campaigns, absolutely. But that's actually created for young people, specifically young people that already grew up, let's say they were born in the 90s, already grew up in a pretty prosperous China. They don't look to the West for all their answers. They've maybe even gotten a chance to study in the West, but they'd end up coming back because they said, oh, they don't even have, high-speed railway that's, filled with poverty, crime, all kinds of sort of social economic questions. It's not all that it's, cracked out to be. That being said, this moment since Trump until now has helped politicize those younger people. And in those initial years, especially through COVID, because that was really rough period of just pure fake news, just spreading all over the world. And it created a generation of what online has been called the little pinks, right? They're not quite red, but they're kind of socialist curious. You can call it that. And words such as imperialism or anti-imperialism, U.S. imperialism has been back in this lexicon. And so I think that's quite interesting. We're not saying that this is, a fully huge transformation, but there's a constantization that has happened in recent years. And on the question, I think I want to just touch on the grassroots political power. I mean, there's absolutely recognition, even that a bit of the quote I mentioned from Xi of his assessment, or the party's assessment, is that during many years, the CPC also, the members also kind of grew detached from the grassroots base, especially in the countryside, and it's not an accident that one of the first things that she did when he came back into power was initiate what's called the mass line campaign, and basically to be able to try to encourage and create campaigns so that cadre party members are reconnected. And we see that and probably one of the most historic kind of campaigns is the targeted poverty alleviation campaign, the last 10 years that lifted the last 100 million people living in extreme poverty in the countryside out of extreme poverty. At Tricontinental, we actually had a chance to go down and meet different, people from the countryside, specifically in a very poor region, a historically very poor region called Guizhou, to understand this process. And we published a study called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China. So if any of your listeners want to know a little bit more about that aspect, I think it says a lot about real grassroots organizing and mobilization that's been happening in the last few years.
Yeah, if Giuliano, you want to jump in, let me know if you have additional questions.
Yeah, no, when I want to jump in, I'll jump in.
Okay. So more touching upon the socialist intellectual, at Tricontinental, you guys have published a translated article on China's historical position within the global South, written by Wang Hui, who's a prominent intellectual of the Chinese New Left. Could you tell us more about the influence of the New Left within the Chinese popular consciousness and also the government?
I mean, I think the New Left was very, very, very broad, covers a broad spectrum of thought really. I think for listeners that might not be familiar with it, really emerged in the 1990s as a critical response to a lot of these economic reforms that began with Deng Xiaoping. But I think it's almost too broad to be any one thing, because the criticism come from, from a social democratic position to a kind of far left to different Maoist positions, so there's that. But of course, Professor Wang Hui has been closely associated with the New Left, and I've actually had the opportunity to study with him in my PhD that I'm doing now here in Beijing. So, I mean, he is also one of these people who's written about, that depoliticization that we just talked about. And the sort of tendency towards a bureaucratization of this party state away from this revolutionary struggle. And he even published a book of essays in English with a very provocative title, which is The End of Revolution. So, many, many, many interesting things, and I highly encourage readers to look at his work, because a lot of it is translated. But I think fast forward now to 2025, China's very, very different from the 1990s. So you can also see Professor Wang Hui's work has also, he's continued to produce intellectual work reflecting on those changes as well. There's one article that's very, very interesting he wrote, and I believe there's English translations out there called, it was for Lenin's 150th anniversary of his birth. And he wrote an article called, I think it's something like On the Revolutionary Personality. Anyways, there's some interesting parallels that you can reflect on around the historical role of Xi. It's very subtext. But anyways, I encourage you to read also his more recent works. So anyways, we published this text that you mentioned. I think Wang Hui specifically, as a historian, his work really helps us understand China from these different moments in a longer historical trajectory, which I was mentioning before, but also questioning the very concepts we use to analyze China and its processes, and in this particular essay that you mentioned that we published, which, he was basically challenging even the idea of time, the idea of the century is very much a Western construction, also imposed to think about China's revolutionary processes, but also other revolutionary processes on the peripheral areas of the global economy. But I think what this leads to, and why we want to publish this, as well as another initiative we've been doing called the Wenhua Zhonghang, a journal for contemporary Chinese thought, is that we've been trying to bridge or attempt to bridge the gap of this access to Chinese thought, Chinese voices. There's a lot of, China watchers or China analysts, but actually we don't get enough about translations of Chinese thought in debate. I think there's a kind of misconception, and it's very much constructed, that so much censorship, so much authoritarianism, there's no debate. Of course, it's a kind of paternalistic way to view a society of 1.4 billion people that's actually very dynamic. To think that yes, you rule with an iron fist, no one talks. It's unbelievable, but that's a kind of I think still colonial mentality that we still live with, especially I think in even many sectors of this Western left we were criticizing earlier, still used to assess China. So Wenhua Zhonghang, the Chinese journal, was created in 2008, really in a moment to also kind of revive discussion and debate from a broad section of left. I don't think most people would even identify as new left, but maybe they would be categorized as such. But I think we can expand our concepts. And so we started publishing as Tricontinental. Now it's twice a year on translating some of these issues, particularly for us interesting for this global South. How does China see its own development? How does it assess the development of socialism? And also, how does China see its position with respect with the rest of the world? And so this is so far, we don't have an Italian edition, but if anyone feels like translating from the Spanish or Portuguese versions, or even English, it's there. And we really want to be able to build a bridge with a variety of left thinkers in China today, because I think information in this moment where it's so weaponized, it's really important to combat that with with engaging with real debates and discussions. And, as Mao famously said, without investigation, no right to speak. And I very much think that's the attitude we should take about anything that we want to discuss on.
So yeah, I was mentioning before the small talk that we had with Gabriel Rockhill over here, and like one of the things that it spurred a debate, and one of the questions that somebody from the audience is that like they asked him like, okay, you've been talking very well about China the whole time, but is there something that you disagree with the way the Chinese government has been carrying the policies? And like he was thinking about it a little bit, and then he answered that he thinks the Chinese government is not very good at cultural warfare. And one of the struggles of China has been, like historically, I think, has been it struggled to project its influence beyond its borders. And on the contrary, last September, the U.S. Congress passed an act to authorize more than $1.6 billion over the next 5 years to basically to badmouth China. And this, along with the ongoing attempts to ban or control TikTok, shows how much importance the U.S. government places on controlling narratives both at home and abroad. At the same time, much of the art world and the academia are still dependent on Western ecosystems, which has close ties oftentimes to financial capitals and military-industrial complex. So what do you think China's strategies is in response to this?
I would agree very much with Gabriel Rockel's assessment. No matter what, I mean, if we go back to Samir Amin's analysis of what is imperialist control, he talks about these 5 controls, right? And we can say in some ways that the U.S. has lost some of its hegemony in the area of economic and production, particularly. It hasn't lost any hegemony in terms of how it weaponizes the U.S. dollar, as well as other mechanisms such as SWIFT. So China's very far from competing in that sense. But there's 2 areas that absolutely U.S. has hegemony over the world. One is through this communications means, ideological realm, and the other is military, which we recently launched a study in Tricontinental called Hyper-Imperialism that basically documents, that U.S. spend on military is actually double what it reports, because there's many things that they don't count, that they count for China, for example, nuclear spending and other things like that. That's 1.5 trillion, by the way. That doesn't count all the kind of military spending of NATO and also allies, that is more or less under U.S. control. That being said, that's an aside. On the, let's say, the cultural front, the ideological front, absolutely. And it goes back to our question about the TikToks and the social media, digital sovereignty. China has been very good at sort of protecting, I think, Chinese people on the whole from not having complete domination by these sort of U.S. platforms, but also these are platforms that circulate U.S. ideas, right? The hegemonic ideas. But that being said, the most of the world, what is the social media they use, right? The social media they use is largely controlled by the U.S. and the U.S. military-industrial complex, and that's where they're going to get information about China on. So I think that's a really hard one for China. I don't know what its strategy is. I know that in the last 2 years, there's been a big emphasis, including Xi Jinping has made speeches on this, on the role of international communication. But we know, the U.S. has way longer history. It has the Hollywoods, it has the Netflix, it has way more tools at its disposal that are influential. Just as a little aside, because I don't know why I put myself through this torture, but I watched a series recently on Netflix, it was one of the hits called, I'm forgetting the name now. It's called The Lioness. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's about this special ops, at this sort of like Black special ops in the U.S. military. It's an all-women troop that gets sent to take care of the dirtiest of business, And of course, it's so fascinating. And it's not, obviously, the big bad enemy is China, but how they managed to connect everything. I'll just give you a very, very quick synopsis of, and it's not a spoiler, but basically, there is Mexican gangs go into U.S. territory, arrest a U.S. congressman, like take her hostage. And obviously, this is done as a kind of act of war because it's on U.S. property. But of course, who's behind it? It's China all the way, in China, sending these, U.S. gangs. And then somehow it all links back to the fact that China is helping Iran build nuclear bomb. That's literally the kind of, and this was one of the most successful series at the end of 2024. So I'm just saying there's a long way before China engages in those types of, cultural battles. I think it's a hard one to win. But one of the things I think China can do is, maybe Red Note, people on Red Note is actually helping more than anything China's image abroad.
Yeah, one of the memes was that China bans TikTok, US users flock to Red Note, and then it was a face of Xi Jinping saying, "Do nothing, win." So I thought, like, maybe that's the strategy. So, yeah, next question is, a key feature of neoliberal capitalism is the lack of future vision. In contrast, the banner of the CPC is Xi Jinping's
Sorry,
thought.
Michele.
Yep.
Before this question, in the warfare field, in the last years, I mean, we have seen now with the hyper proliferation of digital content. The incoming, the arrival of the platforms have multiplied for 10 times, 100 times the number of content. So we see from, US financed cultural projects, everything. Sometimes also something that is quite, charming for our point of view. No? But what you always see is the concept that, that is the anthropological base of neoliberal culture. That is, every person is a single and subject separated from all the rest. If you struggle, you can win. If you lose, if it's just because you haven't struggled enough. And when you see from a very broad point of view, when you talk about cultural warfare, it looks like you should not just, giving a specific interpretation of a historical period or a political subject, but just giving a cultural idea broadly that, problems are complicated, and just, the humanity or a country or a communities have to stay together to solve the problem. No, it looks like more conflict between individualism and we call it in Italy. I don't know if it's a term that you use in English, that is communitarism. No, let's say. And it looks like from this point of view, if you want to make a cultural, battle in the West, it's not just having cultural products that can compete with the Western ones, but it's very deep. What I want to understand is the cultural production that we see in China has this difference, deep difference from the one that we see in West. I repeat, also when it take a political point of view that is much closer to what we think that the neoliberal classical propaganda. If you think that if there is this kind of cultural production in China's, exporting it is in itself very, very, very difficult. If there is this deep shift of point of view, if you think, and so how is it possible to export, or at least not to have a little piece of general Western debate and cultural production that introduce this deeply radical different point of view?
No, I mean, that's a fascinating question. It's something I'm quite interested in because watching in the last years, especially during COVID, it was the first time ever that China's film industry actually surpassed that of Hollywood in terms of production, number of full feature films that are being done, and also the amount of money that was being spent. That being said, the impact is, incomparable, but also because it's not being produced for necessarily for an export market. It's really for the domestic market, for Chinese people. Most people are watching Chinese made films. And on the other side, we're seeing that less and less of US blockbusters were doing well in China because they were not corresponding on a cultural level. I think it's not just a political sentiment, it's also on a cultural level, the values level did not correspond. I think what you said, and that's also a very deep question. I think a lot of the films and series, even though they're actually put on platforms like YouTube for free without subscription, I don't think many people are going to watch those uh, because they're done in a very different way, and maybe with this sort of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I actually have a list. I always collect all these different TV shows that I've been watching of recent years because they help really explain, and because TV series and movies are also used as a way of, in a way, political education in China, how to explain, one of the most popular series around anti-corruption, but it also reveals, why did corruption get so bad? How do you reveal those contradictions, and how do those things kind of get resolved? Poverty alleviation, other kinds of questions, many contradictions in the 1990s emerge. How do people go into organized crime? Well, that's also linked with sort of the economic reforms, blah, 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 blah. So there's really interesting things there, and they're available, but you always see, I think your point about individualism and collectivism is very true. Almost always how the story gets resolved, if it's not an overtly political, like there's leadership of the party in organizing a society, because the society is, led by a communist party first and foremost. It's also, collectively resolved. One of the biggest hits of the last years is this sci-fi movie called Wandering Earth, and this will be a little bit of a spoiler, but anyways, you don't watch it for the ending, you watch it for all the sci-fi effects. But the planet is about to be destroyed because an asteroid is about to hit the planet. And instead of usually one hero saves the day, or elite group of people might be able to flee planet Earth and find, colonize another planet. What was it? Oh no, we're going to save all of humanity. We're not going to leave, but all of humanity has to come together to try to move the planet Earth away. I mean, it's quite huge. And that's a kind of resolution that would not really work for a blockbuster hit in the West with those sets of cultural values, because it wouldn't even seem believable. But here it was one of the biggest hits of all time in cinema history. So I think you have a really good point. Though we might have some chance, at least, with some of the leftists, let's hope, at least in the world, that might be interested with those socialist characteristics of telling stories through film. But if anyone's actually interested, I can share afterwards, and you can also share with your viewers some of these recent series that's online, because quite interesting. They have English subtitles, maybe have Italian, but you'll have to check that afterwards.
Yeah, actually, like most of the Chinese film and TV series production is usually freely available on YouTube with subtitles, so it's actually quite accessible. So yeah, if there's no other questions in these regards, I'll jump to the next question, which is a slightly more geopolitical. But yeah, as we saw that in the cultural warfare, China's been struggling to project its vision beyond its borders. But also in the geopolitical sphere, to some extent, one of the key tenets of the socialist project in the global south has always been internationalism. But China's policy of non-interventionism has prevented China from taking higher international profile or intervening in some of the contentious issues. So how do you see China's way of promoting internationalist cause? And do you think that the current and recent conflicts in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, as well as the tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, and we could also put in this category also like the current threats that Trump has been waging on Panama, for example. Do you think these changes will at some point force China to forego this policy of non-interventionism?
Of course, non-interventionism is a core pillar of China's foreign policy. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I mean, it's for the last 70 years, right, since those 5 principles of peaceful coexistence were created. And realistically, what we've seen is that China hasn't, sent troops across its borders in almost half a century. It's not going to go and install a political leader or dictate a political system, the so-called exporting revolution, as we might have seen in earlier eras. And certainly thinking about Mao's era of internationalism, I think China is also a very different country than it was then, right? China was a very poor and underdeveloped country, pretty much diplomatically and economically isolated from the rest of the world. Today, China is not that, right? China is the largest economy by, purchasing power parity terms. It's the largest trading partner of most countries in this world, and it's eradicated extreme poverty for a huge population, and it's on its route to becoming a high-income society. But saying all those things, I mean, internationalism or non-interventionism doesn't mean, I think, that China is this passive observer, just like seeing and letting things happen, and I think we have to sort of analyze, how does that internationalism take place, or how does intervention look at? And one of the things I thought were very interesting about Xi Jinping's speech he gave during New Year's, or the Gregorian New Year's, he mentioned a couple of things that I think are useful to help us think about. I mean, he talks about peace. I mean, peace seems like a very abstract word, but maybe not so much in a time when we're seeing increasing, military aggressions, that as a solution to many of the social and economic crises of the world. And one of the things is, I think we've seeing China promoting this sort of peace, let's say, or intervening in some areas by trying to become, I think it's still a very new role, and it's testing out how to become a mediator, political mediator on the international stage, kind of helping fulfill this role as a big nation state. We saw this, a couple of years ago with Iran-Saudi rapprochement, since we're talking about the Middle East area. Last year also hosted the 14 Palestinian organizations, to come together in this Beijing Declaration, some pathway towards unity. That work is ongoing. So, of course, we know that some of these efforts have, the U.S. and its allies have been trying to sabotage, but I think there's something to be said about prudence and being a mediator of a political situation in the face of these escalating U.S. provocations, and who knows what kinds of unpredictable aggressions that Trump was gonna, because he's less predictable. But anyways, we don't know. Some people say there'll be less wars, but then he's talking about annexing allies from Canada to Greenland to Panama. So it's all kinds of questions that we don't know. But what this really means, I think, is really important. I mean, China's role is that it's also, look, we're on a brink, of a possible nuclear war, because more and more the West, especially the U.S., be it its politicians to its mainstream media, have been suggesting that a nuclear war could be one. But we know that, there's no one who wins in a nuclear war. I mean, that's absurd thinking, right? It's not China winning, it's not Russia winning, it's not U.S. winning, it's all of us losing. So I think in that sense, that kind of playing, that kind of prudent political mediating voice is an area that China needs to increase its intervention in, let's say. And I think on the other hand, in terms of, I've been seeing more and more, it was also mentioned in that speech, but also others, this idea of increasing solidarity, deepening solidarity, especially amongst the global South. I think one of the things we saw at the end of 2024 is China sent its second shipment of 70 tons of equipment to Cuba to help restore its energy generation. Of course, we know last year Cuba was absolutely devastated by a series of natural disasters, but most importantly, it's the decades-long U.S. blockade, that basically has devastated the energy system there. And we know that this is useful, highly important, these kinds of acts of solidarity, because Cuba, for a brief moment, was taken off the state sponsor terrorism list of the U.S., but then Trump puts it back in. So I think in these ways, now it's very good to see Cuba now brought into the kind of BRICS family as one of the partner organizations. I think that's another thing that China has been acting on the international stage, is how to build other platforms, alternative platforms, multilateralism as a possibility, whether it's through financing, whether it's a development possibility, whether it's a political kind of counterweight. I think these are highly important in this age towards militarism, towards basically destruction of the planet. And in that way, I think these are more subtle approaches than how China is approaching the question of internationalism and engagement or intervention in global politics.
Anything from Giuliano? Otherwise, I got the
No,
last
it's okay.
question.
Go.
Okay, so last question is about the environment, and with Trump coming back, what do you think the impact of his next presidency will be on a global scale, and how does this will stack against the backdrop of Chinese effort and in the Chinese efforts in the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump has been notoriously bad on the climate, track record, anything environmental. We saw it in the first presidency. He called climate change a hoax. He pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which he again pulled out just now as one of his first acts. He ran on a campaign, the so-called drill baby drill, which is just, unbelievable, right? Basically trying to boost the domestic oil production, promising to push down the petroleum oil prices at one of his major campaign aspects. So these are all bad for the environment. It's all bad, not just for the U.S., for the entire world. And of course, through executive order, he's already revoked some of these things, not only withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, but he has revoked some of the, let's say, minor advances under the Biden administration, whether it's around pledges on electric vehicles. They had set a certain, I think it was half of all the vehicles being bought in the US by 2030 should be electric. There's some subsidies for people to buy electric vehicles, to installing wind, solar, hydrogen, other renewable forms of energy. But all of these basically have been already rolled back or will be threatened to be rolled back. And so I think one of these things is another example of the US trying to, step back away. But the thing is, it's not something you can step back away. The climate, we have one planet that we share. This is not something you can say, oh, we're just going to exempt ourselves from. This is not just a, wanting to sanction the world. This is about the future of humanity, right? And so I think this is one of the things in this sense that looking at what China has been doing in the last years, especially acknowledging, I think, a lot of the environmental consequences that came from this early period of rapid economic growth is very interesting and very necessary. Whether or not, whatever you think about China's political system, I think China has been doing quite significantly, showing leadership, I think, on the environmental question. One of the things we published in the latest Wenhua Zhonghang issue is specifically on that. And the theme of the issue is called On China's Ecological Transition. And we kind of approached it as the editorial team to look at the first aspect is, okay, how does China sort of acknowledge some of the heavy environmental costs that came with being today the factory of the world? China produces almost a third of manufactured goods of the world. This comes at a cost not only for the Chinese working class, but also for, air, water, land, and, everything around. But then how do you also begin to transition to a different, what's been called a new energy economy? And these are things we've been seeing. Not only electric vehicles have been getting a lot of attention, but in the area of solar energy, wind energy, and other things to try to transition towards, China's pledge for 2060 to be a carbon neutral society. So these are challenges I think China is trying to confront head on. Things that I think anyone who cares about the environment, anyone who calls himself a leftist or just a human being might be interested in studying. So part of putting this out is to try to engage in that discussion, because I think a lot of the understanding of China's environment seems to come through a very outdated lens. they still have this image of, oh, Beijing, where I live, everyone's wearing masks and, that kind of air apocalypse that was 10 years ago. And, there's lax environmental laws and all this kind of stuff. They still have the image, but that isn't the image that's actually quite accurate of how, the transformations have really outpaced that way of seeing China. And it's important to study it too.
And this was my last question. So if Giuliano has anything else.
No. I'm okay also because it's 52 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't want to take things like kidnap things for the whole day. So it's enough. And we will have, I hope, chance in the future to talk about China again with Tings. Thank you, Tings, very much. And thanks for the work you always done with Three Continental. That is one of the few lights that we have in Western published stuff that we can try to use to understand something and not stereotypical about China and about global South and imperialism in these days. So thank you very much. Thank you, Michele. Thank you from 99 Media. That is the new name. We have changed the name now, and we don't still have the logo, so we have to design the new logo. So thank you very much, and we will see soon.
Thanks for joining us for this discussion with Tings Chak. If you're one of those who thinks we have a lot to learn from the path that the Communist Party of China has undertaken in the past 75 years, or if you simply want to see more content that challenges the mainstream narrative, don't forget to give us a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to join the community of those who sit back and enjoy watching the decline of the US empire, then hit that subscribe button. You may also want to support our work by donate via PayPal or GoFundMe, also at the link below. Your support helps us keep this conversation going. I'm Diego, and this is 99 Media. We are an Italian-based collective of journalists, philosophers, writers, artists, whose goal is to build a real media for the 99%. Thanks a lot for joining us, and I'll see you all next time.